Yes, MF Doom combo, you're in. That's right. You read correctly. My heart's always warm when my audience can still read. Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you are doing well. And today we are embarking on an exclusive conversation with a man who has worn many hats, not just the one he's literally wearing right now, but he's an artist. He is a critic. He is a label head. He is an author. Most especially for this conversation. Skiz, aka Sh Fernando Jr., he has this new book out, Chronicles of Doom, which I have been enjoying the hell out of. Unraveling Rap's Masked Iconoclast. Obviously, it's a book about MF Doom. It's part assessment of his work. It's part biography of his life and his artistic progression. I've really been digging into the book, gathering a lot of information that I didn't know otherwise, and I'm really impressed with what you've been able to compile in this piece over here. We'll get into it, but first I wanted to just say thank you for making the time and coming through.
Thank you, Anthony. Pleasure to be here.
All right. First off, just to kind of start digging into it, where exactly, when you began with this book, do you start with a biography like this? Because with Doom, even for those who loved him and his work, there's just so little to go off of information-wise. Like, where exactly do you find that first thread that you begin pulling on that eventually led you to, well, I mean, the host of things that you present in this book in terms of the issues he had with immigration and even his early life growing up? What were some of the initial steps that you were taking to sort of dig into some of the information that you found and presented in this book?
Okay, well, like everyone else, I found out about Doom's passing, on New Year's Eve, 2020.
Right.
And I was pretty shocked because I was a fan of Doom. I had followed his career. I consider him a contemporary. He was only 2 years younger than me. And for such a young guy to pass away was a huge shock,
Right.
So I eagerly kind of listened to all of the podcasts that came out after the announcement of his passing. Like in January, there was an MC Search did a podcast, New York Times did a podcast. And, I was just completely amazed at the life that this man led, just both as a person and as an artist. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that. So I was like, I had just turned in my Wu-Tang book, From the Streets of Shaolin. And obviously I was looking for another project to do. And I was thinking, wow, I think if anyone deserves a book, it's Doom, So that's when I started initially doing the research. And as you said, there's not a lot on Doom. You start on the internet, you access the interviews that he's done. There's a lot on YouTube and stuff like that. As you mentioned, I'm a music journalist as well, and even though I never interviewed Doom personally, a lot of my friends did. So I checked in with people like Pete Agustin, Dave Ma, people who had actually done articles on him and done interviews. Actually, Pete was the guy who started Female Fun Records, which put out Doom's first Special Herb series. I think he has probably one of the deepest, most intimate interviews with Doom that I've ever heard on his podcast, The House List. So that's basically where I started. I started with people I knew, internet, and being a label head myself. This is a small community, the indie label community. Word Sound was never strictly a rap label. We put out all types of music: dub, hip hop, experimental, world music. But we did put out a lot of hip hop, and including the Prince Paul Psychoanalysis, I might add, which was I think that was Paul's first solo release. And Paul happened to be a real kind of mentor to Doom as well. I remember Paul back in the day telling me, you should work with Doom. You should work with Doom. unfortunately, I was so caught, I was running a label single-handedly,
Hmm.
at around the same time Doom was doing his thing. I never was able to connect with him at the time. By the time I tried to connect with him, he had already moved to England, and it was very difficult to um, even get to him. But long story short, that's how I start. That's the genesis of this project. It started off by um, me thinking what a compelling character this guy is, and then just starting research on the internet. Eventually, I ended up interviewing about 50 people who were connected to Doom, including family, friends, collaborators, studio engineers, anyone I could get to who would talk about Doom and who had a Doom story. And as you mentioned in your intro, Doom was a very private individual. His inner circle respected that privacy. And when I approached people like Curious or Big Ben Klingon or Sadiq, his manager, all those people declined to participate, which I fully respect, but I was able to work around it and still get enough people to talk to me to put together the book. So.
You were talking about some of the discoveries that you were making, and one thing I'd like you to speak to is, some of the most shocking and tragic things that we know of that happened across Doom's lifetime, like his brother passing, for example, were very much public knowledge, and a part of like his origin story. I guess one of the shocking things to me when reading the book, and maybe this is due to still like a lack of knowledge because not everything is known about the guy. But what was surprising was maybe the lack of surprises in a way, because it seemed like, and again, I'd like your assessment on this. It seemed like his upbringing was so normal, in comparison with like maybe sort of like what a lot of people would be presumed, or a lot of people would presume to be like your average rapper's sort of like, story of growing up or being raised and so on and so forth. Outside of his family his parents separating, it seemed like he led like kind of like a very kind of regular, uneventful, almost like suburban sort of lifestyle, and was kind of like a normal, nerdy kind of comic book and cartoon kid for the most part.
I think that's a fair assessment. He grew up in suburban Long Island, Long Beach, which has got the nice boardwalk overlooking the Atlantic. Single family homes with lawns, and people had space. So it's not like the gritty city, but it's right over the border of Queens. So Long Island, is known for that. There's so many great hip hop acts that came out of Long Island. From Rakim to EPMD to Prince Paul, the leaders of the new school. The whole different type of hip hop coming out of there, because these guys were able to study the art form from a distance. They still had close proximity to New York, but they were able to actually create in a much more peaceful environment. And I think Doom was definitely one of those people. He grew up in a pretty stable two-parent family. Both his parents worked. He went to school like any normal kid. He was a BMX freak, skateboard kid, graffiti writer. He got into all of that stuff. And he just happened to know uh, MC Search and Pete Nice, who took him to a whole new level.
Yeah, and what's sort of funny about like, and maybe this is sort of something that you could like kind of bring context to, because another important thing about this book that I feel like will be an essential for a lot of people to read is there's, outside of just the Doom story, there's so much hip hop history throughout the entire book. And, I remember when I was first getting into Doom as somebody who was just into underground music generally, like in the 2000s, I know it's kind of like readily accepted as just, common knowledge that Doom is like one of the best rappers of all time, and he's so influential and he's so significant. But like, back during that early to even mid 2000s era where he was like really starting to like get big and gain that momentum. Like if you were into MF Doom, you'd be looked at like you were a weirdo or like, it wouldn't be sort of considered hip hop in the way that like, a hardcore Jay-Z or Kanye West fan would be sort of like taken at the time. And, but when you actually get into this book, you sort of see how truly hip hop he really is in terms of like his connections to, acts like Third Base, as you said, but even having cross paths with guys like Tupac Shakur at one point. Like there's like so many weird sort of happenstance cross sections between him and so many different legendary records and artists and events and time periods. And, were all of these things just stuff that you were kind of like stumbling upon and learning for the first time as you were doing these interviews? Like you really kind of created or really illustrated a web of like how truly connected this guy was to a lot of different things and records and artists. Whereas, and I think this was by design, like he sort of portrayed himself in a way where he was like alienated from all of that and almost like had nothing to do with any of it, and like in his own little kind of isolated world, when in fact, like he did actually have deep connections to a lot of this stuff.
Well, being an older head in the game, to me, my era is like 86 to 96. That's my era of hip hop, which is really like the golden era,
Sure.
So, and Doom is from that same era. So, it's like everyone forgets, or a lot of people forget about KMD. They were a hot group back in the day. They were like the heirs of the Native Tongue legacy.
Right.
And for Native Tongues, I'm talking about Jungle Brothers, De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, Black Sheep in there too. Mm-hmm. And KMD was like this up and coming group that kind of fit right into that whole clique, it was a whole different brand of hip hop. Whereas on the West Coast, it was more kind of this hard gangster style that was, was like kind of taking over the country. In New York, we had so many different pockets of creativity. We had our gangsters, we had our Cool G raps and our BDPs, but we also had all types of acts, and so Doom, to me, Doom is part of that golden era of hip hop. I mean, he grew up in that era. He grew up influenced by those artists, and KMD put out their first record in like 1991, so that was like right in the cut. And where was I going to go? So, I think it's important to add this context because, hip hop didn't just start yesterday. There's really a long legacy to this art form. Even though we're 50 years into it, there's even stuff even before that time that influenced hip hop. So I think it's always important to know your history. You can't really talk about stuff unless you have like a broader perspective, a broader framework in which to place things. You know what I'm saying? So I think it was very important to have that history in this book and to kind of contrast Doom's personal history to what was happening in hip hop at the time.
Yeah, and it gives you context for what exactly was inspiring his work, because when you do look at what he did in the greater rubric of like Native Tongue stuff and New York hip hop broadly, and even acts like Third Base, which obviously, helped him get that first big break. Like, while it obviously manifests in a very different way in his records, you do sort of like see, hey, wait a second, like a lot of his lyricism and his attitude and kind of like his playfulness in his albums, like really kind of plays into that absurd sense of humor that, you would catch on like an early De La Soul record or something like that. Like, that kind of desire to sort of get kind of satirical and, really like lampoon things and kind of like poke fun at things. There's a greater context for that. And it's something that he was like definitely born out of and is made clearer through like, his early days in KMD.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, Anthony, like by the time Doom was popular in the early 2000s, he was popular among the backpacker crowd, and
right.
there was a huge kind of there was a huge kind of division in hip hop at the time between mainstream and underground. And, the underground people were kind of dismissively called backpackers, because like people used to go to shows with the backpacks on and everything. But Doom kind of became king of that realm. You know what I mean? Because, and I'll tell you why, because all of his records, he wasn't fucking with major labels after the whole KMD incident, the
Right.
whole that went down, how he lost his deal, which I go into great depth in the book. So he knew that the way ahead was for him to release records on these indie labels because he was not tied down to them. So between 2000 and 2005, we see how many releases from Doom on, so many different indie labels, and that's how he really made his mark. Because it's like, I think there's even a quote in the book where Doom says, he's normally a lazy guy, but he just happened to be in those missing years, he just happened to stack up a lot of tracks,
Right.
and like, so that kind of explains how prolific he was in the early 2000s. He just had a lot of stuff laying around, and Doom is not one to waste anything. There's no cutting room floor with Doom. So
exactly. Another thing that you kind of like illustrate in this book that I think also contributes greatly to how prolific he was during that time was, like all the double dipping, as you call it.
right.
Because when you look at like, his KMD stuff that he did with MF Grimm, all the special herbs instrumentals, the beats and appearances he would like lend to other artists and collabs he would do. Like, it seemed like because there was a bit of a shadowiness around his output around that time, because through the internet and through him being as underground as he was, you didn't have access to everything immediately. You know what I mean? So as a result, and because there were so many unwritten rules due to him sort of like operating totally on the indie circuit and working with so many different labels and dropping releases in so many different places, he's like recycling verses and lines and beats from various projects and like kind of placing them here and there. And if it ends up coming up as an issue, like it sort of gets addressed or kind of written off after the fact. It's sort of like, move fast and break things, or just kind of like do it and then, respond to the accusations or the criticisms later after the fact. But as long as the project happens and he hands it in and he gets the payment for it, it sort of seems like that was kind of like, his top priority. And as you kind of like painted, it was like almost a mercenary way in which he was like kind of operating between these labels and handing in projects.
And you got to respect his hustle for that, because
right, because who else has pulled that off?
Exactly. And after you get fucked over by a major label like that, you have license to do whatever the fuck.
Yeah, yeah. You're going to every job skeptically now.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the attitude he had. It was like he was like, go for the advance. There's no back end. It's like, so he did have a very mercenary style, but he kind of justified that with the whole concept of the villain, right? That's what you got to love about Doom. It was all his stuff his art is so conceptual all the time. That's really what I love about Doom. Like, one of the things I love about Doom is that, he just went so far against the grain of hip hop that he just really created his own lane. And there's really no one else like him in hip hop that you could compare him to, so.
Or just broadly in music. I mean, for the most part.
Exactly. And the argument I make in the book is that he pretty much transcended hip hop, because you have people who don't even listen to rap who are Doom fans, You have people in other industries who are, in the film industry and all these other who are Doom fans, like. So it's like no one else has had that type of impact, as far as I can see, especially a guy who, what's so incredible to me is that he did all this on indie labels. He didn't have major backing behind him. You know what I mean? He created this mystique, and that was his whole marketing plan. Really, the mystique made people come to him. That's to me, that's genius. because as I said, I'm a champion of the underground. That's why I started an indie label because I wanted to put out music that people that wouldn't otherwise come out. So I consider myself a champion of the underground, and to me, Doom is the underground champ. He worked this he worked this whole thing beautifully.
Just to remind you guys watching, we were talking about this new book, The Chronicles of Doom, written here by Skiz. The new book is out now. I wanted to ask you, again, there's so many eras and chapters of Doom's life and discography and progression that you go over in this book, from the early years to him getting his first big break, to, the KMD records, his brother passing, even the depressive spiral he fell into not too long after, the way he built himself back up and sort of like came up with this new persona, and really the creative process, even down to sort of like how certain features were nabbed for each album, kind of like going throughout his catalog. Which again, I encourage everybody to grab the book and read into all of that. But it again, considering like how you were running into some figures who understandably so were a bit sort of like, closed off in terms of like how much they were willing to share about him in the process of making this book. Were there any sort of like, for you, big questions or bits of information that were like kind of left unanswered by the end of this book? Stuff that you like still wish that you could have like got information on, but like you couldn't have? Because you just sort of like ran into dead ends.
Oh, Anthony, a lot of stuff, man. I mean, as much as I revealed about Doom, I think there's still a lot of unknowns, and I think I have preserved his mystique in many ways.
Yeah.
You know, but let me think about, well, obviously the biggest thing about Doom that I think that I found out that I would have liked to find out more about is his whole interest in all of this esoteric knowledge,
Mm.
hidden knowledge, because I think, and there's a couple people who kind of corroborated this. I think that even towards the end of his career, he was more interested in this type of stuff than he was in making music,
Mm.
because a lot of times, when you're in the music business, your fans, want you to make the same hot album that you made like 10 years ago. Everyone wanted him to remake Mad Villainy pretty much.
Right.
And here's a guy who's constantly growing and expanding. Like, if you check out the later albums, like Born Like This and Key to the Cuffs, those are some seriously experimental albums, man. That shows the
Born Like This is one of my favorites in his catalog. Born Like This is one of my
exactly,
favorites, period, that I
exactly.
think he's ever done.
It's like, and that really got slept on. I went back and read some of the reviews, and
At the
reviews.
time, the reviews were, the people seemed underwhelmed by it.
Right, right. But Doom is the type of artist who's like, to me, he was a real artist because he's about growth. He's not about like, he's not a formulaic artist who just comes up with the same thing over and over again. And whether he wanted to please himself, he was not to please the fans. So, but getting back to the esoteric thing, I think that is one subject that I would have loved to sit down with Doom and like really get into it, because I'm into that stuff myself. I'm into conspiracy stuff, UFOs, the spiritual, stuff. Some people call it new agey, but I think Doom was like really a guy who like heavily researched that and went down these rabbit holes, and that's where he got a lot of material for his work too.
No, for sure. No, and that was actually kind of a big question that I had going into this interview, because the chapters in which you reference a thought leader such as Dr. Malachi Z. York, for example.
Right.
I was curious, given how important of a figure that seemed for Doom, I was just wondering if you had any further information on like how exactly his teachings or anything along those lines might have impacted or informed his overall kind of ideology or like life outlook. You know what I mean? Because Doom is somebody who comes across in his music as very opinionated, you know, in terms of like what's bad, what's goofy, what's this, what's that. Sometimes, you know, those opinions or perspectives would go against the grain or get him in hot water or whatever. And, you know, I was kind of curious as to like, to what degree. Obviously he was passionate about it. Obviously he went to certain talks and involved himself in, you know, like this kind of world to a particular degree. But again, it's not exactly 110% clear in the same way that it may be with other artists who maybe more wear their ideology on their sleeve, to like
Right.
what degree that informed all of his thoughts and perspectives on the world. Like, was it something he adhered to and almost like, you know, an ideological purist kind of way, or was this just kind of like a gateway through which he explored lots of unknown, weird, as you said, sort of esoteric things?
I think it was more of a gateway,
Mm.
because the whole, you know, I don't know if you've read the Dr. York chapter yet, but the whole
Yeah,
nuance
I've gone through the Dr. York chapter.
philosophy is pretty like all over the place. You
No,
know,
for sure.
it's like one minute they're, you know, one minute they're Islamic, next minute they're Hebrews. You
But I
know,
mean, but with those types of ideologies, that's how they tend to be. You know, there's
right?
they sort of seem to be changing to their benefit.
They're
You
very
know,
fluid. They're
right,
very fluid, and I think what Doom got from that whole thing was just to be open-minded to all information. I think what that taught him was that all information is relevant. You know, it's like everything is relevant, and you can't really dismiss something offhand. But I didn't find any real connections between him and Dr. York, besides the fact that he went to Dr. York's last lecture, you know, around 2000 in it, or sorry, around like 2003, 2004. But that was the time that he happened to be living in Atlanta, you know,
right.
so he was close to that the compound, and you know there were other people who he was friends with, like Big Juss, um, and the Signs of Life, who also happened to be down there. And in fact, it was, I think Just sent me a picture of Doom and him and Signs of Life on the Eatonton, or was it Eatonton, Kennesaw? I forget the place in Atlanta where Dr. York's compound was, but they went down there for like Savior's Day or something. There's a picture of Doom down there. That's a lot, because he doesn't really say much about the New Nubians. You know, he doesn't really say much other than the fact that it was a really funny quote. He said something like, you know, as many times as you see those people, not one person is smoking a cigarette. you
Right.
know, whatever that meant. Doom was a smoker anyway, so I don't know really what he was talking about, but
Yeah, it was almost kind of like, the way you described it in the book, there was almost kind of like a Mormonist, it was sort of almost like behavior regimen to it in terms of like,
right.
you know, being clean, you know, just sort of like being straight, flying right, holding yourself to account in certain ways, almost like a,
Discipline. You know, it's kind
yeah,
of like the same discipline that the Nation of Islam instilled in people, you
right,
know?
right. Okay. But yeah, to your point, that's definitely something, it would have been interesting to sort of like know more about, but you know, we may never. Um, you know, you talk about Born Like This and Key to the Cuffs, which like, you know, are projects upon release, got mixed receptions, still to this day, maybe get mixed receptions. Are there any other records, maybe besides those, and maybe you want to dig into them a little bit further, that you feel like in his catalog are a little underrated or underappreciated? Because obviously Mad Villainy and Food, so on and so forth, loom so large, you know, in his catalog. Are there other records that you feel like people don't pay quite as much attention to and they should?
Well, personally, I like a lot of the Special Herb series
Mm,
because, you know, I think Doom is underrated as a producer. You
right.
know, like a lot, you know, obviously a lot of people, he's an MC, so obviously people fixate on the rhymes, but Doom had a very, how do I describe it?
He had a very particular style,
He had
production
a
wise.
very special style, and it's once again, that old school influence, that golden era influence, because during that time, it was not acceptable to like steal other people's ideas. That was called biting back then, you know. So
Right.
like never even rapped over the same beat or stuff like that. So Doom, Doom, to his credit, he would pick he would sample stuff that no one else would even think of sampling. Okay. So we look at Operation Doomsday, all of that cheesy 80s R&B. I call it cheesy because I'm personally not into it.
No, I
Doom
get what you're
actually
saying.
made me like that stuff. The way he recontextualized it and did it, it was like, I could definitely hang with that. Another another thing that another sample source that he kind of monopolized was the whole cartoon thing, right?
Right.
Not just the vocal snippets from the Hanna-Barbera cartoons, but like actual musical cues from like Spider-Man cartoons, from Scooby-Doo. There's some really dark stuff in there, and no one had really tapped into that stuff. So Doom, being the guy that he was, with this no biting mentality, he brought all of these things into the mix and made them kind of cool. You know? And even like later on when he was sampling like stuff like barbershop beats type stuff. You know what I'm talking about, that kind of genre.
No, go like, for example, who?
What's that guy? Who's the artist? I was just watching Haircuts for Men. You know Haircuts
Oh,
for Men.
okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, I sort of get what you're talking about in terms of the cartoon stuff, because like a lot of those music breaks that would turn up in those shows were just like dastardly, which fit in with the villainy, sort of
Right,
like concept
right.
of the whole thing. And on top of it, in terms of like what the standards and sort of like what I guess you could say were like kind of tender touch points at the time were for like sampling what could or couldn't possibly get you in trouble as an artist working samples into their work. People are scanning for that stuff as much as they were sort of like, hit records of bygone eras, which he obviously dealt in too. But no, to your point about those records, your book does a great job of putting them in context, because the thing is, like, in the greater scheme of like what we view as kind of like, the pantheon of instrumental hip hop, a lot of people think like Madlib, Dilla, DJ Shadow, but like considering the time period in which those like Special Herbs albums came out, like he should be in that same conversation, but he's not.
Exactly. And you got to kind of wonder why, right?
Right.
Like still to this day, I'm not sure how popular those records were, because I know that they were probably maybe not more than one or two pressings
Mm-hmm.
at the time.
And even the most recent repressings have been sort of like few and far between.
Right. Yeah, because there's some that are still out of print and hard to get. Now a big issue with those also was the covers, because they stole the covers straight from Marvel.
Right, exactly.
Marvel did like a cease and desist,
Right, right.
But it's kind of funny now that they had a Marvel comic recently that kind of paid homage to Doom.
Mm.
And I don't think Marvel ever sued Doom, as far as I know. So it's like,
he's helping their brand at the end of the day.
he is, and he got away with it,
Oh, go on.
No, and I was just going to add that Doom was one of those guys who didn't give a fuck about what he's like paying for sample clearances and stuff like that.
Right.
Fuck that.
One thing I would love you to get into that I think this book, again, Chronicles of Doom, it's out now. Check it out, guys. That I think you should get into a little bit. What the book does so excellently is what I think even a lot of hardcore fans are not fully aware of is, and there's like almost a dozen of them that you go over in the book, all of these conscious reference points to the Doctor Doom, like comic series, origin story, everything. It sort of seems like there's so many breadcrumbs throughout all of his records, throughout even the ways in which he carried himself as an artist that are like, I don't know, was it all conscious? Was some of it accidental? I mean, the closeness with which he sort of seemed to follow all of these reference points, it sort of seemed like if anything was dictating his behavior more than esoteric beliefs, was like, Dr. Doom did this or behaved in this way or operated in this way. I need to find a way to sort of like work this into my own work and conduct myself by the same manner as like my own playbook for success.
I think, yeah, I mean, like, as I said before, Doom was a conceptual artist. And when he discovered that Dr. Doom connection, he really ran with it, right? Like, I think that really resonated with him. The whole concept of the supervillain, and also, as you know, from the Marvel comic universe, all of the heroes, even the heroes, have flaws, and that's what kind of makes you identify with them. Even like someone like Spider-Man, he's got flaws, he's got human frailties. Doom obviously had his flaws, but I forget where I was going with this, but what was it? What was your?
Well, just basically like maybe what were some of the most surprising connections or parallels to Doctor Doom that you found kind of like digging up all this information, like things like,
things one of the ones that I didn't know, because I'm a Marvel fan. I pretty much knew the Doctor Doom backstory, but one of the things that I did not realize was the whole doombot thing.
Right. Yeah. That's one thing. Yeah.
That was great because I thought that was something that Doom had just created himself. I didn't know that there was actually doombots in the Doctor Doom comics, and that any time that he was in a bind, he would send these robotic clones out. So as many times as Doctor Doom died, he never really died,
Right.
And I love how Doom used that concept of the doombot in real life, because I don't think anyone else could have pulled it off like he did. I mean, imagine sending someone to perform a concert in your stead by giving them the mask. That's a pretty ballsy thing. People are paying tickets to come and see you. And then they realize that it's not you.
He did it so many times.
And he never paid the cost. Like, people would come just to see if it was him.
Did you have, and again, I read through that whole section of the book, but did you, in the process of doing this, were you able to get a firm-ish figure in terms of like around that time period, how many Doombot performances there were, versus like how many actually went out there for? Like, were you able to get a ratio or a split?
I wish. I wasn't able to do that, but I could tell specific shows where there were Doombots, there was Atlanta was one, LA, San Francisco. When he went on the Most Def tour, that was a big one. But then, speaking to his assistant at the time, this lady Courtney Brown, she told me that and I don't think I put this in the book. She told me at one point that Doom was taking hot yoga, and he lost a lot of weight. So some of the shows that you thought it might be a Doombot because Doom didn't have the big belly, it was actually him. Now, I could not confirm this. That's why I did not put it in the book. This is another issue with doing a book like this. You get a lot of stories from people.
Right. That would have been another thing he was very ahead of the curve on too. Hot yoga wasn't exactly the thing during that time. He would have been an early adopter as far as Western rappers to hot yoga.
Right. But as I said, I could not confirm that. Like, I had one person saying, usually I need to have at least two people saying something to include it as a fact, preferably three.
Right, of course.
I just want people to know that I'm not idly putting things in there, especially I'm very conscious of the fact that this man is no longer with us. He can't defend himself. So if I put out something about him that's not true, that's a major L for me. You know what I'm saying? So
Right.
I made very sure to corroborate stuff that people told me, because as you can imagine, I got a lot of crazy stories about Doom.
Was there this sort of seemed like it might have been another example of this, but one thing that I did have like some questions about after having kind of like read a bit about it in the book was this moment in his career post Danger Doom,
Mm-hmm.
where he was really starting to get like that mainstream taste of exposure. And then he had like that kind of really large EMI deal potentially staring him in the face. But then it seemed like he kind of instead just kind of shrunk away from that, was doing the doombot thing and almost was kind of operating in a way that was in a way destructive to his career, but in other ways not, because it created more mystique, as you said. Like, did you have any more information, or were you able to find out more about why exactly he didn't end up going that route? Because at least on some level, he didn't seem like the type to sort of leave money on the table. You know
Now, what
what
are
I
you talking
mean?
about? Because he did actually do the EMI deal.
So is that where Born Like This ended up going? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
yeah. Lex Records.
Okay, got it.
Lex
Okay.
Records was the one that had.
Got it. So that was like the throughway. Okay. So
Yeah, so he
yeah.
did get a nice.
So that's interesting. Is there any reason as to why, like, because for a deal that big from a label that large,
Mhm.
it sort of seemed like he had like a lot of creative control over that project in terms of how it came out, how it was presented. And, I mean, that's a great album. I love it. It's got a lot of amazing production on it, but in terms of like the rap music of the time or the rap music that preceded, it's not a mainstream album. You know what I mean? Like,
But you got to look at the label that it came out on too. Lex is not a mainstream label
no,
either.
it's true. It's true,
Lex would be kind of an indie
still a
label.
big deal that he seemed to have a lot of control over the flow of the record.
I think that's, I think creative control was his number one thing, especially after the whole.
I mean, that also considering it was a time where there were sort of like, I would also cite like maybe Lupe Fiasco as an example. That was a time period where a lot of like alternative, left field, conscious rappers almost had like a shot at mainstream exposure, and then had like a very kind of awkward transitionary period, or like we're coming out with records that a lot of fans really did not like the direction of. And, through that change, it seemed like Doom kept the griminess.
Yeah, because that's where his heart was at, I mean, you can give a guy money, but I think he was still had that indie mindset, you know what I mean? And he was still, even when he had the big deal, he was doing stuff around it, he was doing stuff with Adult Swim,
Right.
the whole Missing Notebook rhymes, which turned into a huge debacle because he didn't have the rights to have that stuff.
Right.
You know?
I think there's at one point in the book you even said something like he couldn't have been mainstream even if he wanted to be.
No.
I think I like when you came to that point, I think that's how you kind of like described it.
I think if Doom had lived now, maybe we would have seen that happening now.
I was going to ask you in your assessment, like, do you think if he were getting started sort of closer to this time, do you think he would have seen anywhere near the success that he is now?
I think so. I think the trajectory of his career, it's kind of, whenever an artist dies, I hate to say this, but whenever an artist dies, their stock kind of goes up.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But I think in Doom's case, his stock would have gone up anyway, because that was really the trajectory that he was on. And imagine like if we had the Doom Starks album,
right?
That would have been a huge thing, because they would have been able to put that out if he was alive. I think the whole reason that never came out is because now he's not with us, and the business is just going to be too much to handle on that one, because now you got Ghostface and Doom. They're both going to want a big payoff for that album.
Right.
But yeah, I think if you look at all the projects he was doing, all the side projects with Flying Lotus, with Muggs, with West Side Gun, and all these people, I think he would have just been so well positioned now. And I think now would have been his mainstream era. You know what I mean? But who knows? He could have easily, knowing Doom's mentality, who knows? But
Oh, I mean, the thing is, I believe just recently I read something about like Mad Villainy having hit like 1 billion streams on Spotify between all the tracks and everything. And as I was kind of like saying earlier, back during the time when that record came out, as well as it did, considering like everything that I had to compete with and everything that was an obstacle in front of it, it still wasn't considered hip hop in the same way that like some larger releases of the time might have been. But now, a record like that is more hip hop than anything. Is there something that, you as an artist, a creator, a critic, in your assessment with that album that you feel like is ahead of the curve that people are more receptive to now than maybe they were at that time? Like what is it
in particular?
Mad Villainy or any of the albums you would have come out with around that era? What is it about those projects that people seem more receptive to now that they maybe couldn't have kind of appreciated as much when they originally released?
That's a tough question. I think because Mad Villainy, as far as I remember, was huge when it came out because there was so much anticipation behind it.
Relatively speaking, but nowadays we're talking about like 1 billion Spotify plays huge. You know what I mean? We're talking about like one of the most respected rappers of all time huge. It sort of seems like, as you know at the time, like it was still alternative music that not everybody was going to be receptive to. But now it sort of seems like there's a general openness to MF Doom across music fans of all stripes that, had to be built upon, had to be built toward in order for us to get to this point. And now it sort of seems like there are things about his music that are just kind of like widely accepted as like, this is just good. This is just fact. And I'm wondering in your assessment, like, what is it about the music that people needed to adjust to in order to be able to fully appreciate it as widely as they do now?
Well, I think with anything, like when it first, when an artist first comes out, like I'll use Wu-Tang as an example.
Sure.
When Wu-Tang first came out, people couldn't understand what it was. Like it was so different from everything else that was happening at the time. It was so grimy and so, so completely unique.
Right.
So I think, Doom stuff is the same way. When Mad Villainy came out, it was the exact same thing. It was so unique, and to me, I don't know. Like I'm a type of person. I don't really care what the mainstream is listening to. I'm into what I'm listening to, and to me, that album was phenomenal. And if mainstream people like it too, that's fine. But that was a ridiculous record. So one thing now about Doom that I've recognized is he's got a whole younger fan base now. I think that could have a lot to do with it. Like he's picked up a lot of young people who weren't even around when he was releasing those records. Do you realize that in the early 2000s? Mm-hmm. We're now in 2025. My college roommate called me before the book came out and said, my 14-year-old daughter is a huge Doom fan. Could you sign a book for her? I was like, sure. 14 years old,
It's crazy.
She wasn't around when Mad Villainy first came out.
Right.
And I think Doom has that. It's like Doom is for the children. He has that. To me, his stuff is, he doesn't curse. It's not really misogynistic like most rap is. It's pretty wholesome in a way.
In a goofy way.
I could totally see how younger people now are kind of getting into doom, you know, 'cause it's
Yeah,
like,
he does
that's a
have a
good
child.
entrance into
Yeah,
rap because it's not like some hard stuff. It's like melodic stuff that you can listen to, you know, it's like, it's not, it's like now today I think there's a very easy entry level into doom. That's what I'll say.
yeah. No, I mean, he has a very childish sense of humor, you know, which he like cut with other things, and then I think adding to that, like the music intentionally so like sounds so cartoony sometimes, and especially on a record like Food, he's like, you know, diving into topics that like kind of everybody can relate to, whether you're 7 or 77, you know,
Right.
be it food or friends and so on and so forth. Um, you know, one thing that you kind of address in the book and you get into, but don't necessarily give a super strong opinion on, I wanted to know your thoughts on, was this idea of like doom being totally separate from the character that, you know, he kind of like built for himself. And, you know, we don't have total confirmation on that because obviously in a lot of ways outside of music, he was so private. But do you yourself buy into that idea that he himself personally was a completely different person from who he kind of like crafted himself as being as MF Doom, as the villain? Or do you feel like the mask and the character allowed him to be maybe more his actual self without worrying about the repercussions, the criticisms, and anything else that might have come along with, you know, oh, this is me and I'm actually saying this. These are my thoughts. You know, I'm saying this behind a mask. So it gives me a bit of like, you know, cushion to say and feel and believe and share certain things that maybe I would be more hesitant to if I were doing it under my own name. Like, where do you feel like you fall on that side of, which side of the fence do you fall on with that?
I think that's a great question. And I will say this, even though in my book, I feel like I unraveled the character of Doom, I don't think I really touched Daniel Dumoulin. I
Right.
don't think I really got into what Daniel Dumoulin was all about because a lot of people who knew him well told me some amazing stories about him. Like, once again, this lady Courtney, who was his assistant for a couple of years, you know, told me a story, and she actually wrote an article in the Source about this. How her, like when her grandmother died, she had to pack up the house, and she asked Doom if he could help, and he like took the subway over from New Jersey and just helped her out. And you know that I wish I could have found more stories like that about Daniel. But I think getting back to your question, I think Daniel really created this character for him to be able to say whatever he wanted to say,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not necessarily representing him.
Hmm.
You know, it's not necessarily representing Daniel Dumoulin because there's so many examples of his kindness and generosity, and you know he was obviously a very low key guy. You know, when you look at the villain was the complete opposite. Like the villain was a very braggadocious, very, you know, and it's like I think some of the character amplified parts of his personality, but then some of the parts of MF Doom were just he could expand into it. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Because I've heard stories of like people picking him up, you know, before a show. He's a super kind guy. You know, like the guys in Philly who collaborated with him on Victor Vaughn.
Yeah.
You know, he was like a super cool guy, but as soon as you put the mask off, there was like a change in his character. Like so many people have said that. Like as soon as you put the mask on, he was not that nice guy anymore. And I think he felt like he had a license to do that now because he's playing a character, you know?
Right.
And that's what he always says in the interviews. He says, I'm not him. That's why he rapped in the third person. He always says
Right.
he, when he's referring to Doom, right?
Right.
So I think that was a way for him to have it both ways. You know, he could have a private life. He could say anything he wanted with Doom, and he could also expand his character into Doom and take Daniel Dumoulin into directions where Daniel maybe would not have gone as a person.
You kind of bring up some of the collaborations that he's done and people who he's worked with. One thing that I wanted to ask your assessment of, because you really go over a lot of those major collabs and crossovers and so on and so forth. At multiple points of the book, you talk about how picky he was in terms of like who he worked with and when and so on and so forth. But like simultaneously, at least in terms of how they read, it seems like so many of these connections and collaborations that happen almost occur by random, or just like are as a result of whatever the circumstances he happens to be in at the time, or I just met this guy, or this guy knew this guy. Like across all of these collaborations, even including like Ghostface and West Side Gun, for example, you know, all of these that he's had across his career, were there any common threads that you sort of found between all of these people that sort of like made these collaborations possible or likely, that he was kind of receptive to them? Because at least on the surface, they all seem so different and seem to land in his lap for just vastly, just a wide variety of reasons.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one, because I think as as you said, like a lot of these things just materialize randomly, and I think Doom was just all about doing work, you know? And I think, especially there's a lot of like remixes he did with like indie rock bands and stuff like that.
Right. That too. Yeah.
I don't think he had any, I don't know if he had any affinity for these bands and stuff like that, but it's like, he needed the work and he did it. So it's kind of tough to answer that question without being able to get into his head, because
we're kind of going into that idea because, one deep collaboration that you didn't necessarily, do a whole chapter on necessarily, one that obviously, like, I imagine on some level had to be fueled just purely by his passion and interest in it. Not like, oh, this is a bag, this is an opportunity or whatever, is like the Bishop Nehru record.
All right.
Because at the time that kid was completely unknown. And he just like pulls him up out of nowhere and gives him, they're rappers who would murder their mom for a whole smorgasbord of MF Doom beats, and for him to double bill his name on the record with them. You know what I mean? And this kid out of nowhere gets the opportunity. Like, were you able to get any information or background on like what exactly made something like that come up in the way that it did?
I think at the time there was a lot of hype on Bishop Nehru.
There was.
He had, I think he had opened at least one show in Europe for Wu-Tang at the time. I think I mentioned that in the book. So I think maybe there was a lot of hype around him. Nas was really into him too, trying to sign him. And I think that might have just been another random thing, because Doom met him at the show.
Oh, okay.
It was supposed to be a Ghostface show, and Doom ends up meeting this guy backstage. They hang out. And I think Doom just vibed with him and said, look, this is a kid. At a certain point, you have to realize when you're getting older in the game, you got to start to kind of stay relevant. You got to start collaborating with young artists who are around,
Sure.
And everyone does it. And I think that
you think at least on some level that was something he was kind of worried about or thinking about?
I think that's what everyone, I think all artists think about that, staying relevant. I think that's, especially older artists who have been in the game for a while. It's almost like a natural thing. It's like you have to bring in some new blood, some new ideas. And I think, and Doom was as much as he was into the money, he was also a guy who was really into energy and vibration. So he
Mm.
must have really vibed with Bishop Nehru to make that happen.
Yeah, and,
That's not really one of my favorite projects, to be honest.
sure.
I don't know what you thought of it. What did you think?
I was not crazy about it either, but I mean, I sort of like I could see he was passionate about sort of like going out there and trying out something, you
Right.
know?
And I think another factor is that he owed another record.
Mm,
So always doing a solo Doom record, I said, is very tough to get over the finish line for him.
right.
That's why he preferred the collaborations a lot
Right.
of the time. Because
Mm,
when you're splitting the work, it's easier to finish
yeah.
that.
And he came into the game collaborating, you know,
Exactly.
he
Exactly.
just sort of like made the best of what, you know, was put in front of him in terms of like his circumstances.
So I think all those factors come into play, especially with the Bishop Nero, because he barely rhymes on that.
Yeah,
It's
no, he
more of
does.
a production.
He's playing more of a supportive role.
Right, right.
But I mean, you know, I think that kind of like answers the earlier question, honestly, because at least in every instance in which you're able to tell a story behind a lot of these collaborations, it sort of seems like the first thing that gets them to that point where it begins to happen is like, we find out that we're getting along.
Right,
You know what I mean?
exactly.
And the thing is, outside of that, there are probably dozens of other potential collaborations that could have happened, but for one reason or another, maybe he was just in a certain situation. He's like, I don't like this person's vibe. Or, you know, I'm getting something off of this that like, it's not going to benefit me. It's not going to benefit me, or this person doesn't get me. It seemed like he was somebody who was very conscious about whether or not he was being understood
I
in
think
a
you're
certain context, and was wary of anybody who didn't take the time or put in the effort to understand him.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. And also another thing is his own comfort level.
Hmm.
That's why, like, when he rolled up to the Stones Throw Mansion in LA for the first time and he meets Madlib, that's a great episode, right? They barely say a word to each other. They just spark a blunt and they listen to music. And that is what kicks off the collaboration. And throughout the whole thing, they barely talked.
Right.
So it was all energy, it was all vibes between them. And I think that's how Doom operated a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So
Again, reminding everybody, the book is The Chronicles of Doom. It's out now over on YouTube. We will link to the book, or you can grab a copy down in the D box. I want to thank Skiz for coming on and really getting into depth about everything you talk about in the book, and other stuff that you found in the process of pulling it together too.
hey man, you've asked some excellent questions, and I hope we got some listeners because we've really put a lot of stuff out there about Doom. And a lot of what I said, some of it's in the book, but you asked some great questions and you pulled out other information that's not in the book. So kudos to you for being a good interviewer.
I only could have done so by reading the fuck out of it. So thank you. Thank you very much.
And
All
thanks
right.
for what you do for hip hop in general, man. Because like we need to dig into this. We need people like you who dig into stuff.
Well, thank you. Because again, you know, this book simultaneously was just like a really great refresher on a lot of old school history. And it was just interesting to read not only the context in which like Doom's music kind of fits into it, but also just like all the artists that he had like literal connections to, and people who he was friends with or like did work for, or like, you know, happened to cross paths with at some point, which again, I'm telling everybody, like you're going to want to read this because Skiz does a really great job of like painting his whole trajectory in terms of like his career and artistry and all of it. So,
Respect.
well, have a good rest of your day, man.
Peace.